Hi, I suppose I should introduce myself. My name is Zachary Campbell, and at the time of writing this, I am finishing up my bachelor's degree at the University of Nevada, Reno. In an attempt to avoid real life for a few more years, I plan to apply to graduate school, and as a result, I must soon face the arduous task of composing a personal statement as part of my application. I'm sure I'm not the only one in this boat, so I wanted to create a presentation that shows how I plan to approach this document and engage with some fun scholarship along the way. Well, my idea of fun anyway. So without further ado, let's just jump right in. So, what are we talking about here? Well, a personal statement, often also called a statement of purpose, is a document designed to showcase one's professional and personal experience in order to convince an audience they are well suited to a given position. In this way, a personal statement is necessarily a rhetorical document. That is, it presents an argument and attempts to persuade an audience to the validity of said argument. This is the frame we will be utilizing throughout this presentation. In our examination of a personal statement, we will be treating it as a piece of rhetoric, as a text with a distinct persuasive goal. In doing so, we will explore the composition of a personal statement on a theoretical level, drawing from scholarship in the field of rhetoric and composition. In other words, the goal of this presentation is not to provide a concrete or mechanical guide to composing a personal statement. Those sorts of tips and tricks articles are readily available online, and a quick Google search will show more of them than you'll ever be willing to read. So before we begin in earnest, I'm sure some of you are probably asking, why in the world should we view a personal statement this way? I just want to know how to write the darn thing. That's a pretty valid concern, and I assure you I'm not just a sadist attempting to find other sadists here. The goal of this presentation, ultimately, is to effect a change in one's disposition towards writing. By understanding and considering the factors and constraints that go into creating this document, this presentation hopes to show how one can maximize their control over a rhetorical situation when faced with a complicated, high-stakes document. So now that you know what you're getting into, let's first start by looking at a real moment in which a friend of mine had to make some tough decisions in his personal statement. From there, we'll build in some necessary concepts like the rhetorical situation and a definition of wicked problems, and then we'll dive headfirst into the complexities of a personal statement and ways we can embrace these complexities to create an effective document. Alright, so my buddy Peter is preparing his application to send out to various Master of Fine Arts programs for creative writing, specifically the genre of fiction. As with anyone in this situation, Peter is tasked with composing a personal statement, a short document detailing his professional, academic, and personal goals, as well as the experiences that would frame him as a suitable candidate. Let's take a look at the moves Peter chooses to make and what effects they may have. First, Peter chooses to interrogate a common quote about writing to serve as a hook for his statement. The quote he briefly discusses is one most serious writers are loath to hear. You know, Ernest Hemingway always said to write drunk and edit sober. The move Peter makes here is meant to call upon shared expertise. Peter is banking on the assumption that his audience has heard this quote and, like him, has grown quite tired of it, allowing him to establish common ground and present himself as someone who shares the same distaste of this quote as others in his field certainly do. Peter then goes on to briefly detail what he writes about and his motivations for doing so. Afterwards, he discusses what authors have influenced him and in what ways. There's a few things going on here. First, Peter is showcasing a skill he knows is valued within his field, the ability to articulate what his writing strives for and what experiences led him to value what he does in his writing. Second, Peter is showing he is engaged with his field and an active member of the literary community. The authors he lists are all contemporary writers whose publications are recent and ongoing, and while it is true that he enjoys and is influenced by these authors, he also understands those who will be reading his personal statement want to see him actively exploring contemporary fiction. After that, he begins detailing his professional experience. He's served as a slush reader, that is, someone who reads unsolicited manuscripts for literary journals. He's worked as a writing tutor at a community college, and he has volunteered for a writing program in which he held small workshops for high school students. All of these are mentioned because they correspond directly with what his program values. As a graduate student, he will have opportunities to tutor, teach composition, and work for the university's literary magazine, so he wants to highlight his experience already doing so. However, Peter does make an abnormal move here. When he's detailing how he approaches his students at the tutoring center, he makes mention of his own poorer grades. This is a risky move, but I think Peter frames it effectively here. He discusses how he originally didn't place much value on good grades, and how he came to the realization that you get what you put in, and he frames this as a lesson he tries to impart to the students that visit him. Finally, Peter ends his personal statement by discussing why he wants to pursue an MFA and what his future goals are. This is expected of him due to the conventions of a personal statement, but Peter again decides to employ another risky move here. He states that one of his future goals is to work with inmates, conducting writing workshops and participating in programs that help them obtain their undergraduate degrees. As he does this, he mentions his own stint in jail, knowing that a lot of programs will notice the felony on his record. He frames this from a place of empathy. His own experiences have informed him that many people in jail are good people who made unfortunate decisions, and he, in turn, wants to capitalize on his opportunities to give back to them. So what happened here? Well, Peter found himself in a rhetorical situation in which he had to pay careful attention to the needs and values of his audience, and present a reality of himself that appeals to those values. He also took this as an opportunity to get ahead of, to control the framing of, some parts of his application that could harm his chances for acceptance. We'll return to some of these moves at the end, but for now, we're going to spend some time outlining necessary concepts for us to consider these decisions fully. Okay. Now that we've seen Peter wrangle with his own rhetorical situation, it's time for our first small bit of scholarship. Pictured here is the classical depiction of the rhetorical situation. Here is the brief breakdown. A rhetorical situation is comprised of a composer, that's you, a subject, in this instance, that's also you, and an audience, not you, just in case you were curious. These three factors both help create and are influenced by the context of the situation. For our purposes here, it is most useful for us to consider the interactions between genre and audience. What we want to focus on is how to navigate the constraints of our given genre, that of a personal statement, in a way that persuades our audience to take our desired course of action. In other words, we want to examine what moves our genre values and makes possible, and how these moves can be catered to what we know about our audience. And with that focus in mind, here are some useful questions you can ask yourself about a given rhetorical situation, some of which will be addressed again later in this presentation. What are some assumptions you, the composer, bring to this writing situation? Are these assumptions useful for your purposes? Do you have any biases that may be limiting you from approaching the situation in a more effective way? Who is your audience? What do you think they might value? What can you assume, if anything, about their personal experiences? In what situation do you think your audience will be experiencing your text? What assumptions do you think your audience might have about your text? Is there any contextual constraints or opportunities you can recognize? How does what you are writing connect to or reflect current issues in either your specific rhetorical situation or in a broader sense? In other words, is there anything about the context of your rhetorical situation that would make the inclusion or exclusion of an element more or less effective? Finally, consider the genre you are participating in. For our purposes, our genre is already defined, that of a personal statement. What is the goal of this genre? What is typically valued in the genre? After reading a few samples, are there any patterns you note? Are there any moves made in the text that tend to reoccur? Lastly, is your audience familiar with this genre? If they are, might they be tired of seeing these moves so frequently? Putting those questions aside for a moment, we are now going to move on to a different lens, and we're going to consider writing in terms of design studies and the decisions that we make when designing a document. So our next piece of scholarship is a little different. The quote shown here is from Richard Marbach's article, Embracing Wicked Problems, The Turn to Design and Composition Studies. The brief breakdown here is that Marbach argues the concept of wicked problems can be usefully applied to teaching writing. As the quotation illustrates, wicked problems are problems that can never be fully solved. That is, they are problems that do not have concrete, replicable solutions. This is due in large part because wicked problems cannot be solved through merely gathering more information. And as we move forward, I think you'll see that the wicked problems we are going to analyze all hit a wall in which we have no access to further information that would guide our decision making. The concept of wicked problems comprises our primary motivation for approaching personal statements on a theoretical level, and the key takeaway here is the shift in approach. Instead of seeking a mechanical and repeatable solution, we are forced to engage with the complexities of making decisions when the potential responses to those decisions are ambiguous at best, and we are forced to acknowledge that no solution will cover this full range of possibilities. Now that we have a working understanding of what wicked problems are, it seems only natural to ask, well, what wicked problems does a personal statement have? Are you sure you're not just complicating this for no reason? And honestly, I can't guarantee I'm not overcomplicating this. But in part, I think that's the goal here. While the following issues may seem simple upon first glance, if we utilize the lens of wicked problems, we can start to see that these issues involve a myriad of complex decisions with a large degree of uncertainty as to what effect they may have. Ominous, I know, but I promise it won't be that bad. So all pretentious warnings aside, first we're going to look at the constraints of a personal statement, both explicit and implicit. Then we'll discuss issues of self-representation, and finally conclude with the most pervasive wicked problem a composer must face: an uncertain audience. Alright, this first problem is the closest we're going to get to wrangling with something concrete. In other words, this is the tamest problem we'll be dealing with, but it does have its fair share of complications. We'll tackle the explicit constraints of the document first. Most every personal statement will ask for the combination of two things: professional and academic experience and personal experience. Professional and academic experience is fairly straightforward. You know what field you are applying for, and if you haven't already, ask yourself what sort of work and experience is valued within that field and thus by your audience. What you can attempt to do if you lack the requisite experience will be discussed later in the following slide. Personal experience is much more complicated, and will be covered briefly here while addressing implicit constraints, as well as throughout the next two problems. A third element that is sometimes required is a justification as to why you want to attend their program. This element often requires some explicit research about the institution and their faculty. Some useful questions to ask yourself are: what does the institution value, and what is it traditionally known for? How can you present yourself as aligned with these values? Is there any faculty whose research aligns with your own interests? In essence, what you are trying to do here is present a meaningful connection between yourself and the institution you are applying to. The other major explicit constraint is length. Most personal statements are about typically 500 to 800 words, or 1 to 2 single-spaced pages, but sometimes you may be asked to write shorter or longer than this. What this constraint forces you to do is identify what is crucial to the narrative that you are constructing. In other words, you have to be economical here. This may seem simple, but everything you include in your personal statement ideally should build upon each other, and necessarily does so. In other words, what you compose in one section influences the reception of other sections, even if an immediate connection is not apparent. On the other hand, lengthening the document comes with a different set of concerns, namely the risk of muddling your narrative or running out of what you would consider suitable material. The former can be mitigated by carefully considering your narrative arc and asking yourself what impact your additional material has, while the latter might require some creative invention on your part. As for implicit constraints, these are formed by the conventions of the genre. The most powerful constraint here is that through a personal statement, you are asked to present a cohesive narrative about yourself. This narrative frequently takes a typical form. One has some sort of experience or problem, and then one navigates successfully through that problem, learning something significant along the way, and positioning themselves as poised for further growth. One problem, as you might have already guessed, is that not everyone's experience perfectly fits this mold. And the next slide will discuss some strategies and considerations for those who find themselves in that boat. Another problem this constraint introduces is the tension between what the genre asks of you and your audience's repeated experience with these moves, which will be covered in the slide specifically addressing audience. So folks, this is the last piece of scholarship I'm going to subject you to. The quote shown here is from Kenneth Burke's Deterministic Screens. I'm providing this because I think it's useful in analyzing the following question: to what extent is one ethically responsible for presenting a true version of oneself in a personal statement? There are a few motivations for addressing this concern. The first is that approaching a personal statement as a rhetorical document may leave a bad taste in one's mouth. Rhetoric, in public discourse specifically, has garnered a negative connotation. It is associated with deception and manipulation. Those of you who have some experience studying rhetoric within the academy probably don't have this association, but I believe it is necessary to address. If we buy into what Burke is stating here, we have to acknowledge that everything we do, every decision that we make, has a rhetorical effect whether we intend it to or not. That is, every decision will necessarily select a particular reality and deflect others. So what does this mean for the question of representation? Taking Burke's argument in its best light, this idea of inherently presenting selective realities eases the constraint of presenting a true or accurate representation, because a holistic representation is by its nature impossible here. This, of course, has its limits. For example, directly fabricating events or experiences remains an unethical representation. However, this does open up a lot of opportunities by providing a greater degree of freedom in the way we can frame and present ourselves within this document. This usefully addresses two concerns. The first concern is, what can you do if your personal experience does not align perfectly with what the genre of a personal statement requires of you? This is a significant concern and hurdle for many individuals attempting to write a personal statement. Sometimes you simply don't have an experience that you can draw on that you can fit into the traditional narrative arc. In these cases, you must creatively frame your experiences to fit this mold, and that's okay. You can choose to present this reality, that you have no impactful experience to discuss, or you can choose to present a different reality. This can take many forms, from enlarging an event you may have found irrelevant or minuscule, but upon reflection is more significant than it appears to connecting several small moments that influenced you and put you into the position you are currently in. In other words, it's all in how you frame and present your experiences. This also applies to an extent to those who lack the requisite professional or academic experience, though I would acknowledge this is a tougher spot to be in. However, just like with your personal experience, consider the different realities you can present here. One reality is that you are an individual who lacks experience within the field. You can present this, but I think we can agree it is not particularly compelling. Another reality you can present is that while you lack experience, you are passionate about the field and eager to engage with it, or that other interests and experiences you possess have led you to wanting to pursue this field. The second concern returns us to a part of the rhetorical situation we brushed over. You as both the composer and the subject. As the composer of this document, you come into this rhetorical situation with biases and assumptions about your subject, which in this case means you have biases and assumptions about yourself. This may take the form of serious political views, or strong ethical commitments, or very heavy personal experiences. You may feel like you have to include these in your personal statement because if you do not, you're not being true to yourself. I'm not saying that if we buy into Burke's argument this concern is entirely mitigated. However, it does allow you to ask yourself the question, is this reality the most rhetorically effective one to present, given the genre I am working in and what I can assume about my audience? So we're at the final stretch of this presentation. This last problem is a doozy, plain and simple, and it comprises the heart of the wickedness at play here. Simply put, there will always be a degree of uncertainty in regards to your audience. This is true of any document, but in the case of the personal statement, we can confirm two specific things about our audience. 1. They are experts in the given field you are applying in, and 2. They have likely read many personal statements. What we don't know is, unfortunately, just about everything else. Most importantly, we don't know who they are as individuals, and we don't know what personal experiences they will scoff at and what ones they will resonate with. That's the real heart of the problem here. We cannot account for the range of responses our audience will have. So what does this give us to work with? The first tidbit we know means that you can assume the individuals reading your personal statement will share many of the values associated with their field. Considering this is most useful in terms of how you should highlight your professional and academic experience, but can also apply to how you present your personal experience. In the example of Peter, we can clearly see how he does this. Every bit of professional and personal experience is meant to appeal to the values he assumes his audience will hold, and even when he is acknowledging something unfavorable about himself, he places it into the frame that he believes his audience will be the most receptive to. The second is just really, really tricky. Your audience is quite familiar with the genre you are participating in, and this constitutes one of those double-edged sword situations. On one hand, they're familiar with the conventional moves of a personal statement, and they expect them. In this way, a lot of your task is to cater those moves to your own specific field and personal experience. But on the other hand, boy, they've read a lot of these things. And like overexposure to any genre, the typical moves can get tiring. And unfortunately, after reading your 50th triumphant tale that just happens to directly correlate to your field, these moves can become uninspiring, or worse, worthy of suspicion. Going back to Burke, if the reality you choose to portray is too ideal, your audience might not trust or take stock in that representation. I think that can be avoided by presenting yourself as an individual who is still in a position to grow, or if you were convincing enough in your characteristic redemptive arc, but it's definitely a risk that should be acknowledged here. So where does that leave us? Well, not surprisingly, it leaves us in a place of uncertainty. There are low-risk moves available to us, following the conventions of the genre as best we can, and those, unfortunately, can have a smaller impact than we would like, though they do entail minimal risk. And honestly, I think a carefully crafted personal statement that takes into account the conventions of the genre and the values of their audience will generally succeed in its task. The more you deviate from these conventions, the larger the risk you are taking. However, sometimes it may simply not be an option for you, or you may perceive the risk as justified by the possible reward. With that in mind, let's end this by looking at Peter's choices again. He felt that there were some facets of his application that he needed to get ahead of, but in the end, we have no way of knowing if this was in his best interest to address. It's possible that some programs would not have looked twice at his transcript, but by bringing up his low grades, he's called attention to it. The same could be said about him mentioning his jail time. On the other hand, that recognition and honesty could have been the reason he was accepted. It could have heavily resonated with one of the individuals reading his statement. But the simple reality is that we don't know the end result, and there will never be a way to achieve certainty beforehand. We can only try our best to adapt and respond to our given rhetorical situations, attempting to consider our genre and our audience as fully as we can to inform our decision making. Well folks, thanks for sticking around this long. This is the end of the presentation. If I had a mixtape, this is probably where I'd plug it, but I don't, so I'll just say goodbye and good luck with your future endeavors in writing.